Debates on religion were at the forefront of intellectual life in the Anglosphere in the late 2000s, and were kept there by the frequent terrorist attacks happening in Western cities in the past decade. In the last few years, this topic has largely receded, as new fault lines have appeared in intellectual life, especially around the importance that should be granted to group identity when trying to understand human phenomena. As even the United States become less religious, political passions seem to fill the vacuum left by the loss of religious faith. With my guest for this interview, Helen Pluckrose, we revisit questions concerning religious faith, discuss their relevance in today's intellectual landscape, and highlight the importance of the criticism of religion that had been put forward about 15 years ago by the so-called New Atheist writers. The intellectual courage and respect for evidence of the New Atheists is more than useful to deal with simplistic and irrational ideologies beyond religion only. So, hi everyone, I'm thrilled to be here with Helen Pluckrose. Welcome back to the podcast, Helen.
It's lovely to be here.
So you're a writer and an editor. Your most recent book is Cynical Theories, which was written together with James Lindsay and published last year in 2020. You worked until recently as editor-in-chief at Ario magazine. And recently you launched the Counterweights initiative, which offers helps to people confronted to pressure to conform to what you call critical social justice in their lives, in particular in their professional lives. So we will touch on that maybe a little bit later in the conversation. Our first topic will be something quite different. Probably there are some similarities, but we will talk about religion, first of all, and atheism, and in particular the so-called New Atheism. So I should perhaps explain briefly what that is. So it's the name often used to describe a forthright and uncompromising criticism of religious faith and practice, which is usually associated mostly with the successful works of Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens, also several other writers. If I remember correctly, one of the first things which you had mentioned in our previous interview was that among the first things you were writing outside of schoolwork, so to say, were texts that were sympathetic to the so-called New Atheism. So can you tell me a little bit more about that? Why were you writing about it? What had been your experience with religion? What made you drawn to New Atheism?
Okay, so I was very much in the new atheist space, and that was really when people sort of first started seeing me on the scene at all, and that was when I was arguing about religion. I was very critical of religion. I didn't write an awful lot of essays about it at that time, but I was certainly I would have been considered one of the new atheists, certainly, and I still hold those views. I am still very critical of religion, both as a epistemology and as a producer of highly illiberal ethics.
Okay, and I mean, what was your sort of background in this? In the domain of religion, were you raised religious? Did you leave a faith at some point, or were you always non-religious?
Okay, so my parents were both atheists, but I at school in the UK we have 15 minutes of collective worship a day, Christian worship, where I was taught that Christianity was true and compelled to pray. And so, of course, I was encouraged to believe what my teachers told me. No one suggested that when they were teaching me about maths and literacy, I should listen to them. But when they were telling me that a God existed and wanted certain things, I should take that with a grain of salt. So I just believed that this was true. I became extremely religious myself as a child. I got myself baptized and confirmed. I suffered from scrupulosity, a form of OCD, which is about hyper religiosity and worrying constantly about whether you have sinned and whether you're in a state of grace. And so I became quite unwell with all of that. And religion wasn't a positive experience for me at first. Well, it was at first. You know, in primary school, it's essentially nice stories about humanism and brotherhood and good Samaritans and things. Although the bit about global genocide by flood is probably not appropriate for very young children. But as I got older and I read the Bible entirely 4 times between the ages of 9 and 14, and I became very, very worried about the concept of hell, that my parents particularly were going to go there because they didn't believe in God, that anybody could go there and that this could be in any way good. I also had some growing concerns that my religious education teacher, my secondary school, had its own chapel, and it was a private school, but it was normally Christian, the same as state schools are. And they taught me that homosexuality was a sin, but that it could be cured. And this didn't fit very well with my feelings towards a particularly lovely uncle I have, who was gay and happy and a very good person. So I became really quite unwell with it. I stopped being able to believe by the time I was about 16. I kept reading the Bible. I was reading theology. I was trying to make sense of it, and there was so much contradictory stuff, so many things that just weren't true, and we knew they weren't true. And like, sort of the Bible. I remember as a child, I remember reading the Bible, and there's a story in which they managed to produce speckled goats by having the goats procreate while looking at something that was speckled. And I'm thinking, if this was God inspired, he would know about genetics. He would know this. These are the writings of an ancient tribe. These are not. This is not the divine knowledge. So I became an atheist intellectually, but I continued being very anxious psychologically, and thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if I go to hell? What if this is a test of my faith? And I became so unwell with this that I was actually hospitalized on a couple of occasions because of OCD and scrupulosity. Now we know that there's a cyst on my temporal lobe, and this is related to hyper-religiosity. So there's a chance that there's a biological reason for me having become such a strong religious believer while being the child of 2 atheists.
Wow.
But I struggled with that for a long time, and then I began to read the works of the new atheists, and particularly the work of Sam Harris and Michael Shermer, The Believing Brain, and some of Harris's work on the soul and how we can know that soul is actually brain. What we think of as the self is the brain, and we can assume that the self dies when the brain does. Now, for a lot of people, this is a frightening thing, and it's something that makes them drawn to religion. For me, it was a big relief, because if my grandfather, the people that I loved who had died, had ceased to exist, they weren't being tortured. So this was very liberating for me, and I was very grateful to the new atheists, as they were called, for producing these texts and helping me to finally free myself from that.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. I don't think I have so much of an interesting personal story as a background to this topic, so I will not discuss my own much. But what you said is interesting. I mean, for many reasons, but in particular, I'm always interested in people who become obsessed with the idea of sin. I mean, not the idea, but the sort of the consequences of sin and the threat of hell. I'm sure you've heard Armin Navabi also discuss this topic. He was raised in Islam, and he became extremely scared of just the possibility of going to hell after death. And it seems to me that if one really takes this belief in what happens in the afterlife according to these major religions seriously, then one should be extremely worried, because if one of the likely outcomes is an eternity of pain and torture, it makes all the sense in the world to be, I forgot the term that you use, but to be hyper aware and to develop some sort of OCD related behavior, because you should organize your whole life into around, sorry, avoiding that. I
Yeah.
mean, no other thing makes sense to me, I would say.
But I think, like, let me, you are looking at things literally. I looked at things
Right.
literally. I think a lot of religious believers do believe quite literally,
Hmm.
but they also don't seem to give it a great deal of thought. I've seen people who are committed Christians spend more time preparing for their pension,
Mm.
putting significant effort into that than they do sort of looking at the state of their soul and whether they're going to heaven or hell. Quite a lot of people who consider themselves Christians or Muslims or believers in any faith that has an afterlife tend to have a more benign view of a God who generally agrees with them and is looking after their loved ones in hell, and will make sure that they see them again one day. And often these kinds of believers aren't the problem. On a general, it's the literal believers who are the problem. It's the people, obviously the greatest problem is the people who will blow themselves up in the middle of a crowd of people in order to go to heaven.
Mhm.
And some people have said, well, this is because 72 virgins. But really, when a lot of I've looked at some of the narratives of jihadis who have martyred themselves, the other promise is that you get to take 7 people
Mm.
to heaven with you, whether or not they have been good Muslims. Now, that makes a lot of sense to me. And there was a girl in the UK who went and joined ISIS, and her reasoning for this was she was worried her parents weren't good enough Muslims. They were going to go to hell. If she went and martyred herself, she could make sure that didn't happen to her family. Now, this is a really, but I can intuitively understand that it's horrible, and this is why I dislike religion so much, because I can't remember who it was who said it, but it really does make good people do terrible things.
Yes, it was Steven Weinberg, and we will actually get back to that very sentence, because I think it's interesting to discuss. Um, yes, so to focus a little bit more the discussion on new atheism. So these books by Harris, Hitchens, Dawkins, Dennett. You also mentioned Michael Shermer, and one could mention others: Anthony Grading, Jerry Coyne, etc. They were quite successful, and they really contributed to putting debates on religion on the sort of at the forefront of intellectual discourse, at least in the English-speaking world. I certainly don't think we had such a phenomenon in the French-speaking world at the same time. But at least in the English-speaking world, it was quite noticeable. And so there were also, there were many people who were, like you and I, enthusiastic about these works critical of religion. And of course, there were many people who were also quite hostile to it, quite critical. And there were many books written in response to these books. And since I had really liked the works of the new atheists, I decided to also look at what the answers were, not expecting to be convinced, to be honest, but just to see what maybe could be the least bad arguments that one could mobilize in favor of religion. And yeah, I mean, I wrote this book now, which is out on Amazon's Kindle platform. I called it New Atheism, Which Apologia? Sort of indicates the point. I mean, indicates the fact that the point was to look at the religious apologetics that we used to sort of counterattack in reaction to the new atheist books. The way I organized the book is I found 5 very recurring themes in the responses to new atheism. So I can just mention them very briefly now, and we can go through them a little bit more in detail. But the first is well, something you've mentioned in passing, which is this distinction between religious literalism or extremism and more moderate forms of religion. This is something on which religious apologists insist a lot. There is something which is a bit similar, the idea that new atheists are extremists themselves. All the arguments that are mobilized on the question of the relationship between science and religion. This is also a big recurring topic, of course. There is the question of morality, which is also a huge recurring topic. And finally, there is all the debates which took place around Islam and what criticisms of Islam were made by the new atheists and were they informed or not. So the first topic of criticism of new atheism that was made was that probably, I mean, according to their critics, they focused too much on religious extremism, or they failed to make distinctions between, extremists and moderates, as people often call them. The idea that the new atheists do not really understand what religion is and how it functions for most people. Maybe they were focusing too much on the texts and not enough on sort of the day-to-day reality of religious belief and practice. So this is, one of the first and most common ways in which religion was sort of defended. So the idea that, okay, you guys, Dawkins and the others, you don't really understand religion very well. And I'm sure this is something you've also encountered, right?
Endless arguments about it, yes. In fact, all of those subjects I've had endless arguments about.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's many things to say about that. I mean, I think there is too much insistence on the part of the religious apologists on a distinction between extremism and moderation that would be neat and sort of binary. And okay, anyone who is not an extremist is a nice, tolerant, loving moderate. I think that's a bit simplistic. This is one of the things that can be answered to that.
I think that as well, religious people, particularly Muslims, I've noticed, they don't like they don't like to be called moderates, because if they're devout believers, they believe that they are very, very Muslim, but they are doing it correctly. They will often argue that the correct interpretation of Islam is a liberal and inclusive and peaceful one, and that the extremists are just doing it wrong. And that's of course one of the problems with the different ways to with believing that what the supreme creator of the universe believes in the first place, is that this can range from anything from being kind and giving money to the poor to murdering people.
Yes, and all of that is in the books. I mean, it's not it's not that the religious books only recommend nice or less nice actions, but there's a little bit of everything. So that's the whole problem, and this is where the questions of interpretation and related
I
issues
think
arise. Yeah.
with that, I think where the problem arises, and I think in Christianity, you're familiar with St. Augustine and his reading with charity principle,
Uh,
because
I'm not sure. No, I don't think so.
so this is where it comes in for me, because I studied religious narratives at postgrad, because I'm just going to make use of all the reading I'd done when I was very, very devout. And the idea, so for Augustine, he said, when you're trying to interpret the Bible, you interpret it in a way that is good. So once you've interpreted it and in a way that's good, then you've got it right. And I think he gave an example of a passage of the Bible where it says that you should take babies and swing them around and smash their brains out on rocks, which I think was about a rival tribe or a non-believers or something. And he said, now this is not literal. How you interpret this is that you stamp out heresies as soon as they arrive. This bit is metaphorical. Now, stamping out heresies as soon as they is also rather violent and oppressive. But this is the problem, and this is what human nature does. Christianity evolves as humans do. We're now seeing a greater acceptance of homosexuality in the church. We're seeing more women being able to be vicars. We're seeing a lot of changes. I predict that the concept of hell will eventually go. But the problem is that Christians are unlikely to say, actually these texts were horrible and we needed to change them. They were likely to say, we interpreted them wrong and this is the right way to interpret them. And it's because of the cultural zeitgeist. So as we become more liberal and more humanist, so do the religions within the society, but they always lag a little behind. So we saw in the UK that 4 out of 5 people supported gay marriage, where 3 out of 5 Christians supported gay marriage. So there was still a majority of Christians who supported gay marriage, but they were not as many as the general population. So there's always this moral lag.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's many things to say on this, and I think you've touched on plenty. But I think there's also the fact that people who you might think are very moderate, or okay, they might not be calling themselves moderate, but the religious apologists would like them to, or would like to call them moderates, or at least would like to present them as showing that religion need not imply intolerance or that sort of thing. But many people who seem very tolerant or moderate might have, very strong beliefs. Like Sam Harris was mentioning poll results showing that, I don't know, it was close to half of the American population, not quite, but several dozen percent were thinking that probably the end times would occur during their lifetime. One can cite, just general religious authorities' relationship with criticizing religion or mocking religion. You might see figures who are always presented as moderates, like the current Catholic Pope. If you ask him to opine on religious cartoons or the cartoons mocking the prophet, he will say that it should not be done. The cartoons should not be drawn. Otherwise, you can expect to be punched in the face. That was his reaction.
Mm-hmm.
So moderation itself comes in moderation in a way. I mean, this this could be a catchphrase to summarize this. I mean, I don't think it's as simple as that to say that most religious people are not terrorists. There is still a lot of, sort of intolerance and obscurantism, which is attached to religion and which, okay, is not as striking, but still very much present. And there's also a little variation actually on this theme, which is some writers have argued that religion is sort of void of any intrinsic contents. People just project their own pre-existing moral commitments or any sort of belief on it. This is something that, for instance, Reza Aslan has argued. There is just a text; it doesn't have any intrinsic meaning. This is sort of a fast food version of postmodernism, probably, and people just project their meaning or their belief onto the text, and that gives the text meaning. But you cannot blame the religious texts for regrettable beliefs. This is the position which is really sort of taking the debate about interpretation to an extreme.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's an element of truth in there, in that personality, the way that a religion manifests is a combination of the holy text and the belief system, and the individual psychology.
Right.
And sort of surrounding culture. So there's a reason, for example, that only 1% of Pakistani Muslims believe that homosexuality is acceptable in any way, while in America, 52% of Muslims believed in same-sex marriage. So culture is obviously making a big difference. But to suggest that the texts don't have any influence at all is going ridiculously too far. We wouldn't say that if we looked back at narratives that justified the Holocaust or slavery. We wouldn't say yes, but some people interpret this in a very moderate way, and they that they actually have lovely ideas in relation to it, and that they wanted to just look after people and make the country better. That doesn't happen. And people who are going to apologize for religion, I respect them a great deal more if they are reformists than if they are revisionists. So somebody who will say, yes, the Bible says this, and this is clearly immoral. The Quran says this, and this is clearly immoral. We need to get that out of the religion. That is more respect worthy, even though it then raises the question of, well, was the prophet or the writers not divinely inspired then, or what's happened? But then the people who say we just interpreted it wrongly. Actually, what's come down through culture is actually nothing to do with the religious texts themselves. It's just been some bad actors that have used power, and this is what the true essence of Christianity or Islam really is. And I understand that people have to, if you're a believer, then and you believe that God is perfectly good, the only logical explanation for the murder and oppression of people in the name of that God is that those people have misinterpreted what God wants. So at the beginning of her book on Islamic feminism, Amina Wadud essentially makes the argument that Allah is just, oppressing women is unjust, therefore oppression of women is against the will of Allah. So this is the same argument as St. Augustine. And it takes us in tiresome circles where we have the people who are looking at liberal interpretations. We have the people who are honestly reforming and admitting that perhaps the original writers of the holy texts got it wrong. And then we have the people who want us to see religion in a purely metaphorical sense. So then we get to, I think, although I don't want to misrepresent his views, I think there we have someone like Jordan Peterson, who is interested in the grand myth, the narrative of Christianity, literally believing that it's true. And this manages to annoy both atheists and literal religious believers. So I think that that's an important part of the problem. I don't see a solution to it. Did you, in your book, manage to kind of navigate a way through it and say how we should think about this?
I think, I mean, I don't think it's something I focused on so much to try and say what religious people should do with their texts, but I did, I think, write at some point something similar to what you were saying, which is if you want to defend religion, maybe in the best way possible, is to say that or admit to the bad parts, to the worst parts, which is what you were saying, and then I think it gives you firmer grounding to actually defend maybe what you see as the better parts, maybe the moral dimension of religion. I don't think there is much to defend the epistemology, uh, epistemological dimension of religion in any capacity, but yes, I think uh, being forthright and not trying to convince yourself that everything can be just interpreted away is probably the more constructive path.
I think this is where those of us who have ethical frameworks that aren't religious have an advantage. So liberals like me, we can look back at liberalism in the past and see that it was failing on many counts. You know, if we look at that. America being founded with the liberal ethos of it's self-evident that all men are created equal, whilst institutionalizing slavery, there's a problem, and that is then resolved by saying this isn't compatible with liberalism. We're doing liberalism wrong. And doing liberalism better. And there isn't any reluctance on the part of liberals to say we might still be doing things wrong. We still need to do things better, and evolving and adapting. And this is why I think secular frameworks that do evolve and grow have an advantage over religious ones, which abound in texts that are either written, you know, from anywhere between 4,000 years ago to the early medieval period. There's only so much you can do with that.
I agree. Okay, maybe we can move to the second family of arguments that were, I mean, according to me, mobilized against the new atheism. The idea here is that, okay, maybe it's kind of a mirror image of the first argument. So first you say that, oh, religion is not the problem, it's those who might take it too far or distort it somehow, make it too extreme. And then people have also accused the new atheists, sorry, of sort of being similar to that, but in the opposite direction. So the new atheists are extremists themselves, was the accusation. Their criticism of religion was too hostile, it was too uncompromising. They wanted to prevent people from believing in what they wanted to believe. These were the sort of recurring themes. It went so far as accusing the new atheists of wanting to repeat the bans on religion that happened in the socialist dictatorships, or yeah, this sort of stuff. I think this family of argument is perhaps a little bit less interesting than the first one, because it's just easier to see that it's not true, and there's not much in it, in my opinion. I don't know what you make from it. Yeah.
I agree. I think, yeah, the argument that the new atheists are too anti-religion is, well, what is too anti-religious? I look at somebody will write a book, or they'll tweet, or they'll give a talk and about disbelief in God and the problems of religion, and people will say, why can't they just leave Christians alone? But if somebody writes a book about the God existing and the positives of religion, atheists don't all rise up and say, why won't you leave atheists alone? We just tend not to either read the book, go to the talk, or we argue with it. So I don't think that we're not criticizing religious people for having strong views and expressing them strongly. We're criticizing what those views are and giving reasons for them. You won't find atheists turning up on your doorstep wanting to argue with you that God doesn't exist. They're not going to be street preachers. They're not equivalent to religious believers in that way. And I know the majority of religious believers also won't yell their beliefs at you or knock at your front door, but some will. So that argument doesn't work. Some people believe very strongly that religion is a negative force, and they argue so to other people who want to engage with those arguments. If you don't want to, you don't have
Yes,
to.
I think behind this sort of complaint is, the feeling or the notion, but it's often just a feeling, if I might say, that religion brings so much value and so much comfort and so much happiness, even, and guidance and any such thing to religious believers, that such a forthright criticism of religious faith is just mean-spirited. It's just it's not nice.
I had a troll who made, I think in the end it was 14 accounts in order to argue that Richard Dawkins was mean-spirited. And I knew it was the same person. I kept blocking him on Twitter because he was making the same point over and over again. He was completely obsessed with Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins at that time, I would often respond to him and he'd tweet me. So he thought I was a target. I'm sure he was targeting other people in that orbit. And it's, well, don't follow him if you don't want to hear these ideas, or argue with them reasonably. There's no point in calling somebody mean-spirited because they think that you have one really bad idea.
Yeah. So I think we can consider this this topic discussed. It's probably not the most interesting, but it is very much recurring in those books. There is a sense of, I mean, and maybe I just said that we shouldn't discuss this any further, but maybe in a way, this is kind of an confirmation of what the New Atheists were saying in the first place, which is, and this is one of their main points, they were complaining, the New Atheists like Harris, Dawkins in particular, and I mean the others, that when you do criticize religion in public discourse, you're automatically sort of marginalized. I mean, it's just something that's not done in polite company, and so this is something that they wish to push back against, and so I think the reactions sort of illustrated what they had seen there.
Yeah, there's a certain privilege. There's a belief that these are privileged belief systems which should not be criticized, and the New Atheists weren't prepared to essentially exempt religious ideas from strong critique that every other kind of idea has to put up with.
Yeah, the next family, it's more of a topic really, in which arguments were concentrated, is the relationship between science and religion. And this is something where there were many different positions that were taken by the sort of the critics of New Atheism, very different, very divergent positions between writers. What has to notice at the outset is that it's commonly understood both by the New Atheists and their critics that at first sight, on the topic of science, the defenders of religion do not have the upper hand. So they have a lot of work at this point to do to argue that there is, a compatible or a good or even mutually reinforcing relationship between science and religion. I think it's sort of the default position on both sides of the argument. And then the defenders of religion will try different lines of argument. So slightly easier path is to try and argue that, okay, science maybe doesn't seem to be so compatible with religious beliefs, but okay, science doesn't know everything. So you can always craft a version of a religious faith that is somehow compatible with with scientific knowledge. You can, sort of retain only what hasn't been disproved, or what you can convince others hasn't been disproved yet by scientific advances. And you can say, okay, this is the version of religion that I can maintain, and okay, it's not scientifically unsound. So it's sort of a, yeah. I mean, you can go ahead, yeah, no problem.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. The non-overlapping magisteria argument, where science has its place and religion has its place. That's one I see made a lot, and of course that's how the God delusion starts. Dawkins says that quite rightly that argument doesn't stand, because religious believers are making scientific claims about the immortality of humans. For one thing, and the existence of hell, how the earth came to be created. There's it makes a claim, so that part doesn't really work. And then of course science and religion can be compatible. People will often argue when what they mean is that a person can believe in science and religion at the same time, but that doesn't mean that they are compatible. It just means that people have more than one framework through which they look
this is
at
also,
the world.
sorry, this is also a very recurring point, that okay, some scientists, some of them brilliant, have religious faith, but as you said, it doesn't really hold any logical, doesn't really hold any argumentative power.
I mean, the best example, I think, is that the Big Bang theory was developed by a Catholic priest, wasn't it? But did he develop this theory by consulting religious texts and praying and seeking divine revelation, or did he develop it by also being a physicist and doing science? The answer is that he developed this using science. The fact that he also had religious belief is kind of incidental.
It is. A large number of variations around this point, but the objective is always the same, is to claim that there is at least one version of one faith which science has not disproved yet. There is, I think we've gone through maybe the more prudent versions of arguing for that. So indeed, one can argue this is the non-overlapping magisteria strategy, that okay, science deals with truth claims and religion deals with moral claims or value claims, so they cannot collide with one another. But this, of course, is just completely false, because religions make very many truth claims. There is indeed the idea that, or that it's not an idea, the fact that some scientists are religious, but okay, it doesn't prove that the methods are compatible. The methods to attain knowledge. Yeah.
I had a look.
Go ahead.
I had a look through the scientists that were on Answers in Genesis, those who believe that the world is young Earth creationism, and they were nearly all chemists. So there weren't any physicists or biologists or people who would really have be fully faced with the evidence that the world is much older than that, and that humanity has evolved from
probably no
other
geologists
species.
either.
I wouldn't have thought so.
Yeah,
No.
it's Yes, I have to say, I actually know at least one physicist. I mean, I am myself, my job is as a researcher in physics, and I do know at least one physicist who, as far as I understood, does believe that the Earth is this young, about 6,000 years old, and we had a few discussions around that. So it does exist, and he was a pretty strong researcher by all accounts. So again, just to illustrate that it exists, but it doesn't show that the religious and scientific approaches to knowledge are compatible in any way. There's also actually more ambitious lines of argument that were followed by some writers like Dinesh D'Souza and John Lennox, who is also a mathematician, if I remember correctly. Um, they do not shy away from the argument, or from the sort of compatibility issue between religion and science. They are more ambitious, and they try to say that, okay, some things that might seem absurd according to scientific knowledge, well, actually, if you know science even better than maybe the average educated person, you would understand that this is possible. For instance, I mean, one recurring point is, okay, maybe God is the cause for the Big Bang. This is something that comes often. Or you have John Lennox, I think, who tries to argue that maybe Jesus, when he was crucified and then taken to this cave, then I think on a few days later, so to say, people were to visit his grave, went to visit his grave, and they found that it was empty, and they saw the linen in which his body had been wrapped was folded neatly there while his body was gone. And I think John Lennox argues that somehow through quantum tunneling, the body of Jesus went through the cloth, and so this is how Jesus sort of escaped his clothes, so to say, without disturbing the shape of the clothes, or something like that. I mean, it's I couldn't believe that I was reading that from a mathematician and an academic. But yes, this is what happens when you try to argue for a predetermined conclusion, one can say. You make very bad arguments, which you think are brilliant, by the way. Yeah, so these are a few instances of people trying to work around the many known and easily explainable, conflicts between scientific knowledge and religious beliefs. There is also the question of morality, which, okay, if the question of science and its relation with religion was seen by default as the home turf of the atheists, maybe many religious writers hoped to establish that religious I mean that religious believers have the upper hand on the question of morality. So here they were arguing maybe from a more confident position, although I mean I think we've already made several arguments in that sense. If you accept, I mean, if you claim that the religious, the source for moral values is your holy book, then you have many insane commandments to defend from your God. So you sort of put yourself in a very difficult position.
And we have the problem there where there's just this assumption that morality is only worth anything if it's worth something outside humanity, whereas in reality, morality appears to be a product of human evolution. If something like a god does actually exist, there's no reason to think that it would have had the same evolutionary pressures as us. and would have developed the same moral intuitions as us. Why, for example, would the Bible describe God as jealous when he is the only one? There wouldn't, he hasn't had that evolutionary pressure for mate guarding or that humans have, which produces this idea of sexual morality, for example, to produce children. God wouldn't have that pressure. It's essentially I think the argument that morality is only worthwhile if it's objective, and in objective they mean absolute and existing outside humans, fails on two grounds. First of all, their morality isn't objective. It's one framework among many, and it has a long way to go if it wants to prove itself to be anything else. And second, there isn't a good enough reason to suggest that morality would be better if it was not human morality, but something larger. The universe presumably is entirely indifferent if we torture each other to death.
Right. I mean, yes, that is true. There's many variations on this argument, and indeed the idea that without religion you do not have a objective, quote unquote, source for moral values is the most common one. I think by now most religious apologists have noticed that atheists do not tend to become killers or rapists or whatever the moment they stop believing. So they are a bit more sophisticated than to just claim that atheists are immoral. But what they often claim is that atheists are sort of using the moral values that derive from religion without recognizing their origin.
That argument particularly annoys me, because that then fails to recognize that Christianity is using the religious the moral frameworks of things that came before it. So in the West, Christianity is essentially rooted very, very deeply in Augustinianism, and that has a strong element of Greek and Roman morality and philosophy in it. And then it has the history of Judaism, and and this all originated in the Middle East, and so there was a whole sort of culture going on there, and everything, you can trace everything back. We can trace certain of our ideas and certain of our metaphors. I might say, for example, I'll carry the cross of something to mean that I'll make a sacrifice on behalf of others. This doesn't mean that I actually believe what is being said. Ideas evolve through different stories, but Christians sometimes act as though they'd like us to just start with them, and also start at their best bits, conveniently overlooking things like the Inquisition, and then and then make up this lovely myth of Judeo-Christian Western civilization, where in fact Western civilization mostly persecuted Jews repeatedly.
Yes, I think we can transition to the final topic, in which I saw a lot of, friction, and I think everyone saw that, which is the topic of Islam. I think in particular Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens were singled out for their strong criticism of this religion in particular, because what they argued is that there is quite a plausible line of understanding between the holy texts of this religion and the worst behaviors of people who claim to be Muslims in the world and who claim to act following their religious texts. So there was a lot of pushback against that, and here, whereas on most other topics, most of the criticism came from religious believers themselves and maybe more Christians and conservative writers. on this very topic of Islam, the pushback came mostly from the political left because there is this intuition that criticizing Islam is a form of intolerance, xenophobia, racism, blah blah. And I think this has been discussed really to uh, death by now.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most tiresome things. When I first started criticizing religion, I focused mostly on Christianity simply because of where I am and my own history. And then I was considered a lefty,
Yeah.
a far lefty, and then a lot of
Mm-hmm.
ex-Muslims joined the movement. And then suddenly
Yeah.
we were far right loons, and this is where post-colonial guilt is mixing with liberal ethics, where the reality is that yes, Western countries did trample all over a lot of other countries, including Muslim majority ones. So now we mustn't ever criticize any ideas at all or think any moral frameworks are better in order to try and compensate. I think this is something liberals need not to fall prey to, and instead support the
Yeah.
liberals in those
I
communities.
mean, this topic is not so much at the forefront anymore, but I think if it ever re-emerges, we will see that the conversation has not moved much past the level of maybe 2016, which was not very much better than the level of 2006. I think there hasn't been much inroads made by the simple points that you were just making, unfortunately.
This is where I think your book is going to have value, because I think people have lost interest in this conversation
Yeah,
because it was so strong for so long, and it went
right.
on and nothing ever moved. And you have now, because I have seen your book, you have now produced really an excellent kind of summary in chunks of the biggest aspects of it. And this is going to come up because religion isn't going to go away again. People are going to keep being born. They're going to keep wanting to know the arguments for and against religion. So those of us like me who have become tired and jaded of having the same conversations about religion over and over again and moved on to a different ideology. I'm now looking at critical social justice. We have got bored. The religious believers, of course, haven't, because they still believe it. So there's great value in having a book like yours out there for the young person who hasn't been through this new atheist era and seen all these arguments and become sick of them, to get a good solid grasp on them. So I think your book will stand in good stead for quite some time to come, precisely because the arguments are not going to change.
Okay, well, thanks for the the very positive outlook on the book. I think we can switch the conversation to what you just mentioned, critical social justice, for the little bit of time that we have left. Um, so, if there is one criticism that I would make of the new atheists, maybe Dawkins or Hitchens, I mean, something maybe mild, I don't know, but sometimes they like to quote this sentence by Steven Weinberg, which you were alluding to earlier, which is, with or without religion, good people can behave well and bad people can do evil. But for good people to do evil, that takes religion. So this is the quote by Nobel Prize laureate, physicist Steven Weinberg. And so it's a nice piece of rhetoric for sure, but it's a bit very simplistic in a way. So you could see that sometimes the new atheists would get asked about the crimes of, for instance, the socialist dictatorships, which the opponents of new atheism often like to blame on atheism itself, which is a serious mistake, by the way. But you could see the reaction of the new atheists. They would probably then retort that blind faith in any doctrine or system, and not only religion, is dangerous. So, in
Yeah.
a way, this is a little bit of a step back from this sentence by Weinberg, and I don't think that if you press them on this point, the new atheists would say that all people involved in the mass crimes of the most destructive political ideologies were intrinsically bad. I think they would certainly agree that, okay, other systems of belief, other doctrines can cause good people to do bad things, to retain the terminology by Weinberg. And yeah, this is not really a contradiction, but it shows that sometimes by one can go a little bit too far in the rhetoric, and yeah.
That's what we see. Sorry, but if you have someone like Christopher Hitchens saying religion poisons everything, I'd adapt that to zealous adherence to ideology poisons everything.
Right.
And with religion, you see, fathers killing their own daughters for having betrayed their honor, according to some cultural narrative that is deeply embedded in a religious faith, or trying to beat the gayness out of their sons, with some particularly devout Christians. This is but then we also see right now with critical social justice ideas, we see people disowning their family members for not believing the right things. We're not seeing people being murdered in great numbers because of these ideological differences, but we see that same mentality. I watched the murder of a poor young woman when she was falsely accused of having torn up the Quran, and she was beaten to death by a crowd, and then she was set on fire, and then she was run over, and it was this kind of mob frenzy. Now this is a real part of humanity when we get into an ideological madness of mobs, or madness of crowds, as Douglas Murray put it in his latest book. And we saw that same atmosphere in the videos at Evergreen College. They didn't grab anybody and beat them to death, but they were stopping cars with baseball bats.
Yep.
You can see that they were not too far away from that mentality where they could actually kill somebody, lynch somebody, essentially for having the wrong kind of thought.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. So this is what I wanted to get at. And okay, we have just a few minutes, I think, left now. But with that in mind, would you like to present your Counterweights initiative, which tries to fight back against the worst examples of this sort of politically religious, so to say, mentality among advocates of critical social justice?
Yeah, so I think an essay I'd refer people to of mine, which predates Counterweight, it's called, it's in Aereo, and it's called Where Now for the New Atheists.
Mm-hmm.
And I argue in that one that the new atheist movement has died down, but that we haven't lost ideologies, we haven't lost extremism and terrible ideas, and we still need to address this. And so I'm arguing for that same uncompromising critical stance and that same evidence-based epistemology and demand for liberal principles to be applied to authoritarians on both the left and the right. So we're seeing, and I'm addressing particularly the critical social justice authoritarians, because they have a lot of cultural power at the moment. But we see as well that there are extremists on the right, that particularly in the US with the QAnon conspiracy theorists and people, and we're seeing an increasing rise of white nationalism and the idea that whites are about to be genocided, and we need to be able to push back at these as well. We need to be able to be consistently liberal rather than being anti anything. And this is why I think this is where I think the limitations of the new atheists, and I'm including myself here, is that there's a tendency there to be anti-something, and you can't really define your identity in relation to something you don't believe in. And in reality, the new atheists didn't. So, Richard Dawkins' society, it wasn't called the Society of Atheism, it was called the Reason and Science, I think it was. And this is, these are what we are for. And Counterweight, similarly, is for science, reason, and liberalism. It's a liberal humanist organization. And so we would call ourselves pro-liberal before anti-woke, even though in reality, when we're trying to help people deal with authoritarianism in their workplace, it is the critical social justice authoritarianism that they're dealing with. When they turn up to work, if they have to do a statement, they're not expected to recite the Apostles' Creed or to make a commitment to white supremacy. They're expected to repeat a certain set of values to do with critical social justice ideas of equity, diversity, and inclusion. That is a significant problem. It is not the only problem in the world, but it is one that we need to push back at, and we need to push back at it properly from a liberal position rather than a reactionary position, a kind of counter-authoritarianism. So that is what Counterweight is about. And I think that I have brought the spirit of New Atheism, that search for truth, and that unwillingness to bow to any sacred cows just because criticizing certain things are taboo in society. I think that is what we are bringing into Counterweight and into other organizations right now that are liberal and that are pushing back at critical social justice in an ethical, non-reactionary way.
Yes. Okay, so I will make sure to link to the Counterweight's website in the description when we do publish the interview, because I think it's definitely a nice initiative which maybe complements what is already happening in universities with the FIRE and Heterodox Academy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we work collaboratively with them, often referring people to them. They're wonderful. So, of all the organizations in the US that are dealing with things, FIRE and Heterodox Academy are really thoroughly ethical ones that I could recommend very strongly for anyone in academia. We need more for people in employment.
Yes. Which is what Counterweight is focused on. Okay, Helen, you've been very generous with your time and with your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. It's always good to talk to you. You always have interesting things to say, and I will certainly try and get people to have an interest in your book. I think it's still, it's not the hot topic at the moment, but it is still an important, and it's a rigorous look at a significant issue that's not going to go away for at least a few centuries. So I'm very glad that you wrote that book, and I thank you for writing it.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much again for coming on the podcast, for revisiting these sort of not so hot topics with me around religion and atheism. Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter at AcadFreedom and also on Facebook.